Link's Awakening is my favorite 2D Zelda game. It's also the first one that I played as much as I did, not because I hadn't played the other ones, but because it was a full-fledged Zelda game that I could play anywhere. It was pretty ahead of its time, and it was the first Zelda game to do a lot of the things that it did, for better or for worse. For the first Zelda game on a handheld, Link's Awakening was ridiculously ambitious. So today, let's take a look at some original ideas and brand new things that Link's Awakening brought to the table. Unsurprisingly, but necessary to mention, is that Link's Awakening was the very first Zelda game on a handheld. The first three games were these long, involved, and epic adventures that at the time could only be properly housed on a home console. Zelda 1 was already pretty ambitious in scope, and with the next two entries, the games only got bigger and bigger. The second game was quite a bit longer, and by the time A Link to the Past rolled around, the size of what a Zelda game was had almost doubled since the first game, complete with a full story, tons of items, upgrades, variation in dungeons and enemies, two versions of the map. Zelda became this enormous game that only Nintendo's 16-bit powerhouse could handle, and then they went and made a game that was basically just as involved, almost as long, just as immersive, and slapped it on a little 8-bit monochromatic brick. After playing really basic and short platformers like Mario Land or puzzle games like Tetris or Yoshi, the prospect of being able to play a full-size Zelda adventure on a handheld blew my mind. Link's Awakening is every bit as big, immersive, and engaging as its console counterparts, even more so than the first two games, and by a long shot I'd say. It was one of the first games that really proved that full console experiences could be had on a small portable system. And Link's Awakening wasn't just good for a Game Boy Zelda, it was the complete console experience made portable and was every bit of a mainline entry in its own right. So up until Link's Awakening, The Legend of Zelda had just been, well, The Legend of Zelda. The series wasn't really about Link himself, and more about the ultimate goal of saving the princess. With a story concept as played out as the classic princess rescue, it's only a matter of time before someone's gonna want to switch it up, and Link's Awakening did just that. It broke the mold and dared to make a Zelda game that had, well, absolutely nothing to do with Princess Zelda. Instead, we had an all-original story and adventure surrounding Link. Now, I know the game is like 25 years old now, but the story in Link's Awakening is one of my favorites in any Zelda game, so I want to stay away from spoilers for anyone lucky enough to have avoided them this long. But essentially, the story is about Link, and instead of fighting to save a princess, he's fighting to save mostly himself. But saving himself is only a byproduct of something that he just has to do. This time, saving himself is saving the world and setting everything right. The story and every action you take in this game has both a positive and negative reaction. You're constantly doing the right thing, but never really feeling good about it. This is the first Zelda game that has a storyline that's coated with a film of sadness, which is usually credited to Majora's Mask. Not to say the whole game is in-your-face sad, it isn't, but the decisions you make for the greater good definitely cause some cognitive dissonance. Link's Awakening was not only the first Zelda game to not even be about Zelda, but the first to have a much deeper story. Okay, so this one admittedly might be a bit of a stretch, but being the first game in the series on a handheld and being the first to kind of break away from a lot of the conventions set by the first three games, Link's Awakening did some pretty quirky stuff. One example is the inclusion of random cameos from characters of other franchises. Now I know A Link to the Past did have a few nods to the Super Mario franchise, but this makes sense as Shigeru Miyamoto created both series, and those cameos started and ended with Mario. Not to mention, the game was nowhere near as in-your-face about its cameos as Link's Awakening was. Now in actuality, it's really only 3, but if we're going by technicality, there's characters from 4 other game series here. I'm not gonna go over every single inclusion because there's quite a few of them, but a few examples are Chain Chomps, Goombas, and other enemies from the Mario series, as well as the Yoshi doll in the Claw minigame. The game also features an enemy called Anti-Kirby, Wart from both Super Mario Bros. 2 and Doki Doki Panic, which I'm counting as another game, and even representation from a Japan-only Game Boy game called For the Frog the Bell Tolls, which was actually made by some of the same team members who worked on Link's Awakening, and whose engine was repurposed to build Link's Awakening. The Zelda series went on to include cameos here and there in future titles, but Link's Awakening, while not the first game to include cameos, was the first to include ones other than just Mario, and even stepping into some obscure territory. Link's Awakening innovated in a lot of ways that go beyond just technically and thematically. It changed up how the game's items were used and how puzzles were solved as well. So, in previous Zeldas, you got an item and that was the item. Once obtained, you then use your brain to figure out where and when these different items could apply to specific situations to help you progress. Whether it be using bombs on a breakable wall, using specific items to eliminate enemies only weak to said item, or using something like the boomerang to grab items out of your reach. The list goes on. A big inventory of items are a staple of Zelda's overall gameplay, and Link's Awakening took it a step further, deepened the use of items by not only being able to assign any item to either button, including completely putting your sword away entirely, but rich in the act interactive puzzle solving by creating a system where a few items can even be combined with one another or used in conjunction with one another. For example, after obtaining Rock's Feather, Link is able to jump over previously impassable pits. But unfortunately, some pits are still too big for him to jump over. It's only after acquiring the Pegasus Boots, an item that allows Link to run super fast, and combining the two that Link is able to then leap a greater distance and clear them. Setting the bow and the bombs to the action buttons and pressing them simultaneously also creates bomb arrows, which also can be used in certain situations to either solve puzzles or can be used in combat. It's kind of a small inclusion, and it was a bit of a missed opportunity because this mechanic definitely could have been fleshed out much further, but its inclusion definitely deepens the overall experience, and it's a pretty clever idea that Link's Awakening was the first to implement. Speaking of items, Link's Awakening tried something completely new with how the shield works. See, in previous Zelda games, the shield was just kinda there. It protects Link from some light attacks and projectiles when Link isn't attacking, and when he swings his sword, he becomes extremely vulnerable, and the shield becomes almost entirely ripped from the equation, save for a very few specific instances. In Link's Awakening, however, the shield is an actual item that can be used or put away, and tapping or holding the button it's assigned to then makes Link draw it in front of him. The shield becomes not only a much more reliable means of defense, but a manually usable tool that changes up how combat actually works. Admittedly though, the shield is pretty weak, and as the game goes on, the usefulness of it kind of dwindles until you don't bother using it at all. And sacrificing a precious item slot for it becomes a hindrance more than anything, and it seems to be another situation of an honestly brilliant idea that was unfortunately half-baked. But I still will give it credit where credit is due. If anything, I'd say this was the precursor to how shields went on to work in the 3D titles. It seems obvious, but I can't ignore the fact that the Game Boy entry was the first to do it. Okay, so this inclusion is a bit different, kind of unimportant, and wasn't actually included in the original version of the game, but the re-release of this game, an enhanced version for the Game Boy Color, Link's Awakening DX, implemented a feature for the Game Boy printer accessory. Quick rundown for anyone unaware, the Game Boy printer was an accessory designed for use with the Game Boy camera, and printed tiny little thermal printed stickers. To justify the existence of an entire peripheral only really useful with one game, they started to add Game Boy printer features to other games, one of them being Link's Awakening DX. So there's an optional side quest in which 13 in-game photos can be obtained and then subsequently printed out. The photos are obtained by doing specific actions in-game, and each time you meet the specific criteria for said picture, it becomes available to print. Now I do have to note that there are 13 photos, but only 12 can be obtained in any given save file because the first photo you get is one of two options that are completely determined on whether you answer a question with a yes or no. An admittedly not very important feature, but it is something kind of neat, and I honestly do remember myself as a kid printing out a bunch of pictures of a chibi Link and sticking them all over the place. It really adds nothing to the gameplay, but its inclusion is at the very least notable for being an interactive feature that gave you a fun little tangible souvenir for going out of your way to collect things in the game. So as I just mentioned, there was an enhanced port for the Game Boy Color. I've actually been using the footage from this game for most of the video because, well, let's be honest, it's just prettier to look at. This marks the very first Zelda remaster. Well, the very first remaster that wasn't close to impossible to actually play, and at the very least, was the first remaster the US ever got. Now, before you start typing in the comments, technically, the 16-bit remake of Zelda 1 in the form of BS Zelda came out a few years prior, but that was Japanese only, and wasn't even a game you could just go out and buy. It was only available through the Satellaview add-on, and came out in a bunch of different chunks that you had to get as they were broadcast over the service, or you completely missed out on them. Link's Awakening DX was the first worldwide commercially available Zelda remaster, and it was pretty great. Not only did it completely colorize the entire game and added a few other graphical touch-ups here and there, making everything honestly a lot prettier and more immersive, but it also added the printable photos, as I mentioned, as well as an entire extra dungeon whose gimmicks played on the fact that the game was now in color, appropriately named the Color Dungeon. They also went through and ironed out some bugs, tightened up the difficulty here and there, as well as threw in some previously absent lines of dialogue, ultimately making Link's Awakening DX the definitive version of the game. Link's Awakening is and will always be one of the best Zelda games ever created, and it came out on the original Game Boy of all things. While the Game Boy was super limited in processing power and even what it could display, I think the Nintendo EAD team just really didn't care. Despite starting its development as in A Link to the Past port, they didn't try to make a watered-down version of the Zelda series, and instead of trying to copy everything that had been done before, they sidestepped a bit and used the constraints of the hardware they were working with to craft an extremely original entry in the Legend of Zelda series that ended up being just as big and memorable as anything the consoles had to offer. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to keep up with everything I release, subscribe and then tap the bell icon because YouTube said so. And if you want to help support the channel, I also have a Patreon link right there too.